Picture this, a young, sharp-eyed country boy from Jepret, dust on his boots and a second-hand suit on his back, staring down a world that reckons it's far too grand for him. Now cut to the same bloke, a prime minister twice over, the longest serving in the nation's history, leaning into a podium with the calm of a chess grandmaster and the smile of a man who knows the room is his. Between those two frames lies a story powered not just by votes and speeches, but by women, formidable, tender, infuriating, inspiring. Who shaped his stride, steadied his hand, and sometimes sent the press into a froth. This is Robert Menzies as you haven't heard him, the political colossus built in the kitchens, sick rooms, drawing rooms, and crowded halls where women chose their champions, and sometimes chose to test them. Stay with me, because the most revealing lines in this saga are whispered, not stamped in Hansard. He arrives on screen first as a silhouette, a night tram rattling, Melbourne wind up, files tucked under one arm like a shield. Flashback, Jepret, 1894. His mother, Kate, is the first iron in the forge, practical, principled, keen as a tack, a woman who looks at the endless paddocks and insists her son's mind is a resource as precious as rain. You can almost hear her voice in his later cadences, the way his sentences balance like fence posts sunk straight into clay. She teaches him thrift, self-possession, and a quiet sense that duty, once grasped, doesn't let go. It's not sentimental, it's steel. And it builds a boy who reads by lamplight so hard the wick gutters out. Cut to the University of Melbourne, law lectures, the chalk squeak, words like equity and remedy turning into tools in his pocket. He learns to argue like a clockmaker, everything meshing, every cog trued. Yet it's not just mind that rounds him, it's gaze. He notices how a jury's attention flickers, how a secretary tightens her jaw when a barrister blusters, how a widowed client searches for not triumph but relief. He develops a courtcraft that's as much about understanding people as it is about subduing them. In that early baritone you hear restraint, even a touch of courtesy that felt old-fashioned then and feels subversive now. On a warm evening in 1920, we glide into a reception room lit by soft bulbs and nerves. He meets Paddy May Leckie, bright eyes, quick wit, a smile that can double as a verdict. She's the daughter of a politician used to the rhythms of public life, but she's no ornament, she's a strategist in silk. Their union, married later that same year, starts not with fireworks but with a handshake between equals. Watch the two of them as a practical duet, he with his briefs and orations, she with her social radar and stamina. In a city where gossip sprints faster than a cab, they move like a pair who've rehearsed the steps. He leads, she anticipates the music before it changes. Now the camera widens to a nation sharpening itself on the anvil of the 1930s. Depression bites. The air tastes of tin roofs in summer and bad news. The young barrister becomes a politician who discovers that a room full of voters is not so different from a jury, if you respect them. If you take their livelihood and dignity seriously, they'll hear you. But it's the women, the shopkeepers, the nurses trudging home in scuffed shoes, the teachers correcting sums in cold staff rooms, who begin to tilt toward him. He speaks about the forgotten people, and though that famous phrase comes a bit later, you can feel its shape forming right here. A moral claim that the nation's backbone sits not in marble lodges but in fibro kitchens where the rent calendar is the true constitution. Paddy's presence is everywhere in these years, even when she's not on stage. She tests lines on him and he tests them on her. Does that phrase ring true, or does it collapse under its own cleverness? She tells him when his humor helps and when it cuts. She knows which donors to charm and which to subdue with pointed politeness. And in the tough seasons, the late-night strategy failures, the articles that mistake caricature for critique, she remains the domestic ballast. 2 children arrive, and with them a new rhythm, at breakfast briefings between school lunches, the Prime Minister in waiting hanging his jacket on the same hook where the kids leave their netball and footy gear. Here's a scene that jars like a slammed door, in 1939. Menzies steps into the top job after the death of Joseph Lyons, the weight of war already pressing down like a storm that refuses to break. leadership is a lonely room, and he learns it fast. Imagine the hallways of Parliament House after midnight, the air smelling of paper and tobacco, cables crackling from London. He's calculating troop numbers and shipping lanes, and then he's receiving letters from mothers with the ink not yet dry, pleading that their boys not be sent into a meat grinder. The chasm between the briefing room and the kitchen table has never felt greater. He writes back where he can. He doesn't sleep well. And, yes, the cameras find other angles. The man who once built his confidence on reason now discovers the strange geometry of attention, and how charm travels, how empathy can turn to theatre, how admiration becomes speculation. Let's be straight, Australia in the 1940s loved a rumour almost as much as it loved a test series. A tall poppy in the political garden draws the crows. In smoky dining rooms and sunlit verandas, whispers fluttered, was the PM too warm with this dignitary or that grande dame, too enamoured of the ceremony that lures a working man off the job at noon to watch a parade? The press, never much for nuance, fed on it. But when you strip the gossip back to studs, what you see is a man both susceptible to and suspicious of adulation. He liked theatre, and he loathed scandal. He enjoyed attention, and he detested being trapped by it. The record, clean where it counts, shows a public figure whose private life settled into a spacious, often affectionate partnership with Paddy, buffered by Judy and framed by their children's steadying normality. That's not dull, it's discipline. And discipline in a storied life is rarer than sin. Still, the tension builds. By 1941, his visit to Britain in wartime, driven by dutiful instincts and a lawyer's urge to hear the evidence firsthand, sets off a cascade at home. Colleagues mutter. Rivals circle. He returns to a party that's fidgeting under its leader like a horse that's gone cold to the rider's hands. The knives aren't theatrical, they are parliamentary. He resigns. Picture that moment, ink on paper, signature decisive, a career halved. How does he walk out of that room? With more quiet than bitterness, more thought than thunder. And if you want the emotional register, don't look at him, look at Paddy. She doesn't flinch. She makes tea. She tells him not to confuse a chapter with the whole book. She is, at once, the gentle word and the command to regroup. We roll into the years out of office, the wilderness that isn't wilderness. Menzies is still very much in the clearing, stitching together a movement that will bear a simple, audacious name, the Liberal Party. The women's branches become engines, and he knows it. He shows up not as a patrician bestowing favour, but as a courtly campaigner who listens. In RSL halls and school auditoriums, he plays to mixed crowds with an ear bent toward the women who arrive late after stacking dishes and slip out early to check on kids. He knows the price of their time. They lend him their attention only when he's accurate and kind, and, this is the secret, useful. His rhetoric tightens like a well-tied knot. He stops pretending that government can blast its way to national virtue, instead he argues that prosperity must be shared because insecurity corrodes the social fabric. The nurses nod. The small business owners nod. The mums nod. It's not a poll, it's a pulse. There's a scene, mid-campaign, that plays almost comic if it weren't so revealing. After a long day of speeches, he's ushered through a side door into a church hall where a CWA branch is laying out sandwiches. He's dog-tired, coat off, tie loosened. Someone's auntie gives him a scone and tells him he looks pale. He laughs, says he's never been called pale before, eats 2 more scones, and asks the table for their gripes. Not performatively, gently. He leaves the hall with a list of practical fixes that will never grace a headline but will make lives easier. Watch the faces as he goes, not dazzled, but satisfied. He has earned something harder than applause, a trust. And then, here's the shock of the second act, the nation calls him back, 1949. He returns to the lodge not as a caretaker, but as an architect with a long blueprint. The camera tracks behind him as he walks past portraits of predecessors, head slightly down, as if guarding a secret. That secret? He's learned that endurance is not the same as stubbornness. The measure of a leader is how he absorbs history without letting it petrify him. Around him, a generation of Australian women is stepping into professions, into civic life, into influence well beyond the afternoon tea circuit. He courts their votes not with flattery but with a promise that the country will reward effort, that the home and the university and the factory floor are part of the same national project. He is not a feminist in the modern mold, and he is, rather, an old-school politician who understands that you cannot build a stable majority without respecting the people who hold the household budgets and who, when push comes to shove, decide whether a leader sounds trustworthy. When the wireless clicks on. Let's place one moment under a bright, dramatic lamp, our royal tour, cameras flashing, the crowd a sea of hats and handkerchiefs. The Prime Minister steps forward and, with a courtliness that would look absurd on a lesser man, quotes a poet, "I did but see her passing by." It is chivalry pitched at a pitch-perfect register, and the nation sighs. Some find it enchanting, others roll their eyes. And quick as magpies, the whisperers are back, too starstruck, too besotted, too something. But if you slow the tape, what you witness is not tryst or theatre but ritual, a Commonwealth man paying homage to a figure who, for many of his constituents, embodies continuity after years that felt like rupture. For Paddy, standing just off frame, it's almost humorous. She knows the man, knows the temperament, knows that once the cameras are packed away he will talk about budget line items with the same ardor he just brought to lyric verse. In truth, the personal scandal that others strain to see never materializes. What endures is the performance of respect, the statesman as courteous suitor, not of a person, but of a public ideal. Meanwhile, the marriage that barely took a day off for decades thickens into something steadier than romance and harder than convenience. The lodge, scenes at dawn, his hunched over dispatches, hairline lit by a desk lamp, as she pads in with coffee, scans the schedule. Ticks off charity engagements that will take her across town, then asks about a letter from a widow in Townsville that came through her office. Can Treasury move on it? They share a glance that says they've had this conversation every day since 1920 and it still matters. When illness strikes friends, she's the one who goes. When bruising politics comes home, he's the one who apologizes for the hour and asks how the children are. It's a working partnership in the finest sense, buffered by jokes only spouses can tell and by a mutual respect that outlasts speeches and numbers. The relentless tempo of the 1950s and early 60s grinds even a well-oiled machine. Watch him age, the jaw softens, the eyes carry extra weight. He worries about the country's place in an anxious world. He worries about the strains that modernity puts on families who don't have an army of domestic help. He's not a saint. Ask the unions that battled him, ask the students who bristled at his paternal tone. But when he climbs a stage, there's still the rare theatre of a man who can tell a room full of ordinary Australians that their lives are worth political precision. He's not content with applause. He wants assent. And in gathering that assent, women remain decisive, by numbers, by influence, by the cultural reach that threads through schools and charities and the quiet verdicts delivered at kitchen tables when the leaflets are tossed down and the question is asked, what do you reckon? He was, more often than not, the answer. There are temptations in a life so public, to posture, to condescend, to cultivate a private rackety glamour that the papers will never print and the staff will never breathe. But the real intrigue of Robert Menzies is how little of that stuck. He could be grand in manner and conservative in instinct, but he kept scandal at a ceremonial arm's length. He was curious about celebrity but not consumed by it. He could perform admiration, in velvet tones, in a phrase that set radio dials humming, without surrendering to the heat that admiration sometimes unlocks in less disciplined men. If you're searching for the cheap thrill here, you'll be disappointed. If you're searching for the deeper thrill, the way a man's character is made in the daily negotiations with the people he loves and The woman he chose, you've just begun to see it. Because this isn't a tale of a single romance, or a catalogue of dalliances. It's a story about how a country's most influential leader built his authority from the trust of women who asked for competence over drama, decency over swagger, and continuity over cleverness. It's about a marriage where the private citizen and the public titan shared a small table and countless lists. It's about the rare ability to stand in a bright, seductive spotlight and keep your promises tethered to the people who can't afford to be dazzled. He lost the lodge once and it should have broken him. Instead, he walked out into the Canberra cold like a batsman who's copped a corker and still taps the crease, eyes narrowed, already seeing the next over. Now watch the turnaround, a movement stitched in living rooms, in CWA halls, in church basements that smelled of sponge cake and shoe polish, built by women who didn't care for slogans but could spot steadiness a mile off. This is the comeback not told in velvet portraits but in shopping lists and shoe boxes of membership cards. And if you reckon that sounds plain, wait till you hear how the plain stuff flipped the whole board. The wilderness begins with a kettle and a calendar. After the resignation in 41, when the headlines cooled and colleagues spread their hands with that helpless politics, old boy shrug, he and Paddy got to work. No theatrics. She drew up names, and he drafted letters. She knew the women who ran things without ever claiming the title, branch secretaries who remembered every raffle book number, fundraisers who could fill a hall with 2 phone calls and a nudge. They weren't dazzled by Parliament. They were impatient for a party that wouldn't treat their effort as decorative. And Menzies understood, down to the bone, that if you wanted to build a majority that lasted longer than a season, you needed those women not as tiporas but as architects. You can see the pattern forming like a patchwork quilt, square by square, suburb by suburb. He turns up to a meeting in a drafty hall, sleeves at the wrist, not a hair out of place but a humility about him that isn't false. He starts with courtesy and then lands the line that will become a philosophy, and the nation's strength grows in homes as surely as in factories and banks. It is the quiet that gives the loud its meaning. And in the hush that follows, you can hear the decision being made, and this bloke gets us. Not because he flatters, but because he notices. He talks about budgets that are really love letters to children, about the dignity of owning a home, about education as a ladder that shouldn't wobble under a girl's foot just because she's a girl. He doesn't preach progress like a fever, and he sells stability like an inheritance. Across the long 1940s, as the war's echo fades and the ration books fray to soft paper, you witness the birth of a new political animal. The Liberal Party, stitched from the remnants of the United Australia Party and the civic energy of volunteers who've decided that modern conservatism can be generous as well as prudent. The women's sections put shoulders to the wheel. They run fates that feel like festivals, print newsletters on cranky duplicators till their hands go blue with ink, walk streets in comfortable heels, and bring back the gossip that really matters, at which suburbs are bursting, which schools need rooms, where a new rail station would change a life. Menzies treats that gossip like intelligence. Paddy files it like ammunition. He writes and broadcasts the forgotten people, and here the tone turns almost pastoral. He praises the middle-class households that politicians love to patronize and forget to serve. Kitchens become parliaments of the practical. He argues that a nation is healthiest when its citizens can plan their lives without fear of a bureaucrat's whim, when savings aren't punished and effort isn't mocked as selfish. The line that bites hardest isn't the grand one. It's the detail, the way he knows a mother's week by its errands, the way he imagines the last shilling being set aside for a child's shoes. Women hear that, and the campaign posters on the fence stop being decor and start being promises they can test. The comeback election in 49 breaks like a southerly after a muggy day. Trams rattle, radios crackle, and the result rolls in suburb by suburb, like thunder moving across a paddock. He returns to the lodge taller than the doorframe and quieter than the cameras expect. There's no victory gallop. He's thinking about what a mandate feels like in the morning when the bins are still to be put out. Because the big game now is not getting in, it's staying in without curdling into arrogance. Here's where the relationships with women widen from the domestic to the national. A Patty becomes more than a spouse, she's a working public figure with her own docket. Hospital wards, charity balls, long afternoons with volunteers who do the hard yards without pay or applause. She takes the calls that would crawl under most people's skin: our mother who can't get a bed for her child, a widow lost in paperwork. Patty rings the relevant secretary, the department speeds up, and nobody writes a story about it because it's not scandal, it's service. Inside the lodge, she becomes the soft-edged but steel-spined manager of the schedule. There's a running joke that the Prime Minister reports to two cabinets, one in Parliament and one at home, where the agenda includes: don't run yourself ragged and eat something green. But don't mistake courtesy for quietism. The 1950s are noisy with policy, and the camera lingers on classrooms swelling with post-war kids. Menzies, the courtroom craftsman with a poet's ear, turns out to be a builder of universities. He backs scholarship schemes that fling open doors for bright students who can't pay their way, and he pushes for an independent commission to plan higher education so it's not hostage to the electoral cycle. This is where you see the long fuse that runs from his mother's lamplight lessons to a national plan. Education is freedom you can pass on. Watch the first-generation women in lecture halls, cardigans pushed up, pens tapping, turn those scholarships into futures their families have never seen. No banners, no circus, just thousands of small detonations of possibility. At the same time, he governs like a conservative who knows that thrift without imagination is just parsimony. Homes go up in treeless estates that will one day have big gums and kids on bikes. Suburban women master the miracle of lay-by and the ritual of the weekly shop in newly gleaming supermarkets. You can sniff the optimism in the air: furniture polish, linoleum, petrol, and, threaded through it, the anxiety that modern life is. A treadmill with the speed edged up every year. He answers that anxiety the only way a politician can, by keeping the ship steady, by talking like an adult to adults, and by resisting the itch to treat government like a personal stage. The theatre, when it comes, is mostly ceremonial, and that's where the gossip merchants sharpen their pencils. Cue the royal tours. Hats tip, bands strike up, and the nation that still dreams in Commonwealth colours lines the streets 3 deep. When the Queen appears, a flicker of light on a balcony, a hand raised like a benediction, the Prime Minister steps into his most controversial minor role, the courtly admirer. He quotes the old lyric, "I did but see her passing by," with a velvet sincerity that would have curdled on a lesser tongue. Half the country blushes with delight, and the other half rolls its eyes hard enough to sprain something. And in the pubs that night, the jokes write themselves. But if you step out of the banter and into the deeper current, you see a man performing respect for an institution his voters still love, a flourish that costs him nothing and wins him a memory. Patty watches, amused, entirely unsurprised. She has no time for the suggestion that admiration implies impropriety, and she knows the difference between theatre and trouble, and so, truth be told, does he. Still, whispers travel faster than facts. The taller the poppy, the louder the rustle in the grass. Dinner parties hum with speculative nonsense. Somebody's friend swears they saw an arm brushed too warmly, a glance linger too long. But when you check the ledger that matters, diaries, correspondence, staff recollections, you find a man wrapped in routine and a marriage that functions like a well-tuned workshop. If there's intrigue, it's not amorous, it's political. He knows exactly when to charm and exactly when to freeze, and that mix makes enemies reach for the easy smear. He declines to be bait. The trick that saves him is unfashionable, a self-control. Now the frame tightens on the rough patches, because no long tenure runs smooth. The early 1950s tangle with fear of communism, and the country tests itself in a referendum that refuses to put liberty on the rack even for an enemy. He campaigns hard, loses that vote, and, this matters, accepts the verdict without tantrum. Women who mistrust strong men notice. The government carries on, chastened but not broken. Later, a credit squeeze bites, and households flinch. In kitchens across the suburbs, women clip coupons and curse softly. The 1961 election slices the margin to a hair. You can feel the country's breath on the back of his neck. He survives by 2 seats and treats it like a reprimand, not a reprieve. He eases the screws. He listens harder. The message from the shopping queue has been delivered, and never confuse growth statistics with dinner on the table. Across these years, watch Paddy's portfolio widen. She's appointed to leadership roles in charities where the ratio of talk to action is stubbornly kept low. She's dubbed, honored, praised, but the things that move her are tactile, blankets distributed before the cold snap, hospital wards. Repainted, a rural clinic kept open because somebody in the lodge rang the right person at the right hour. She is not sentimental in the soft sense. She is sentimental in the durable sense. She thinks care is a structure, not a feeling. And she never lets the ceremonial displace the ordinary. Staff recall her with the firm kindness of a head nurse, the humor of a matron who's seen it all twice. At home, the family matures under the strange glare that never really turns off. Their daughter, Heather, grows into a chronicler with a sharp memory, and their son, Ken, carves his own path. The lodge becomes a place where state papers and fruit bowls share a table, where grandchildren's drawings eventually elbow aside reports. And through it all runs a current of private jokes between husband and wife, microdramas that keep a public life human. He calls her love in a tone that says the word has more ballast than sugar. She answers with the look that means, yes, but put your coat on, you'll catch a chill. This, in the long run, is the real intrigue, how 2 people keep faith when most of their days are spent in borrowed rooms. Let's drop into a single day in the mid-50s and move frame by frame. Morning, the Prime Minister at the desk, fountain pen skating, margins packed with neat annotations. He flips between a memo on university funding and a letter from a veteran's widow, who both get the same seriousness. Midday, Paddy steps through, not interrupting, just aligning. You've got the hospital at 2, then the women's branch tea. Try to leave before they start the raffle. You remember what happened last time. He smiles. Last time he won a pudding and the front page thought it was policy. Afternoon, the tea. A dozen women in hats and intelligence, asking about petrol, school bursaries, the train timetable. No fluff. He takes notes. Evening, state dinner, the clatter of cutlery, the melody of speeches pitched to diplomacy. He delivers his, graceful as a waltz. Home late. Coat off. How was the hospital? He asks. She tells him, in the spare language of someone who moves among suffering without making it a spectacle. We can fix 3 things straight away. He nods. That's the day. The next looks similar. Multiply by years. But the world tilts in the early 60s. New music, new manners, a youthfulness that looks at his patrician polish and bristles. He is not built for the swing, he is built for the long game. Yet even here, he adapts by refusing to chase fashion. He remains, almost defiantly, himself. There's a courage in that which isn't flashy, the courage not to dress your thinking in borrowed slang. Women, especially the ones who have seen swagger come to nothing, often appreciate that stubborn authenticity. They don't need him to be groovy, they need him to be reliable. The foreign horizon intrudes more sharply. Alliances tighten, and commitments are made that will cost dearly. Conscription returns in a form that will haunt dinner tables. Mothers argue with sons, and wives argue with husbands, and sisters argue with brothers. In these tensions, the government's tone matters. He chooses solemnity over strut, explanation over exhortation. Not everyone buys it. The streets begin to thrum with dissent, led by students whose mothers remember the Depression and whose grandmothers remember the garden sold to pay a debt. The Prime Minister looks aged now, grey in the way of men who have carried heavy boxes for too many stairs. Paddy watches the crowds with an archivist's mind as she sees both the anger and the sincerity. She knows history is turning, and part of her aches. But she also knows what her husband is, a steward who thinks in decades, not semesters. Through it all, the rumors about his relationships with women never grow teeth. There are friendships, yes, collegial, affectionate, sometimes admiring to the point of lyricism when ceremony demands it. There are countless handshakes and 3-second embraces, photographs where eyes meet because that's what you do when someone has queued for an hour to say hello. There are long partnerships with the women who run the party's machine and the charity's lifeblood. But the alleged mistresses live largely in the pages where columnists invent rent to pay their egos. In private, he is careful with sentiment, conservative with confession, and allergic to mess. Paddy's confidence is not the brittle poise of a spouse who's playing defense, it's the relaxed authority of someone who knows the facts and doesn't need to litigate them in public. And yet, for a story that began in Jeopardy with dust on boots, you'd be shortchanging the drama if you left out the glamour that stuck to him anyway. He could tell a joke that skimmed like a stone across a lake, ripples of laughter following the arc. He could level an opponent with a sentence that felt like a pat on the back until you realized you'd just been clinically dismantled. Women in the galleries enjoyed that, wit without spite. It's the courtroom craftsman again, careful with his tools. The press, when it was in a generous mood, called him masterly. When it was not, it called him old. Time, indifferent umpire, sided with the second view as the decade wore on. What keeps this narrative hot isn't scandal, it's the slow ratcheting of stakes. Every year he stays, the risk grows that he'll outlast his own good season. He knows this. The decision to leave isn't a single dramatic stroke, it's a set of converging lines: health, fatigue, a country whose rhythm is speeding past the tempo that suited him. In the late nights, the old law student may have visited. Precedent is powerful, but not decisive. Legacy, in the end, is a thing you protect by walking away before it corrodes. That insight, as untheatrical as a well-balanced ledger, is the beginning of the end. Before we reach that end, look once more at the coalition of women who made the long government possible. Teachers who wrangled classrooms with 30 kids and one blackboard. Nurses who learned new machines and still did the rounds with the tenderness of their grandmothers. Small business owners who ran shops where the till and the crib were within arm's reach. Volunteers who treated the local branch like a second home. They didn't ask for sainthood. They asked for a government that didn't jerk the wheel. They were not always pleased with him, no leader survives that long without grinding someone's gears, but they were, on balance, willing to trust him with the keys. That trust, coin by coin, paid for the long road. And Paddy, well, by the time the cameras catch her in the early 60s, she is what Australians recognize instantly as the sort of woman you want in charge when the chips are down. Unflappable. Wry. Warm without the slop. She shakes 1,000 hands and remembers 100 names. She carries the lodge lightly, as if it were both a workplace and a home, because it is. She endures the jokes about her husband's courtliness toward a monarch with the patience of someone who knows that chivalry and foolishness are not synonyms. When honors come, she accepts them on behalf of everyone who ever rolled cutlery in a church hall and called it politics. She is an argument for that old-fashioned word goodness, reclaimed from syrup and returned to duty. So this is the twist you didn't expect when you clicked on a story promising wives, mistresses, and intrigues, the deepest intrigue is how a couple turned a marriage into a stabilizing institution within a larger one, how a nation's women, some dazzled, more simply practical, helped construct a majority that refused to be just a parade, and how the glamour story evaporates under scrutiny and the discipline story glows. Robert Menzies learned early that admiration is a wind and you can't build a roof out of it. He built with timber heavier than that, a loyalty, courtesy, consistency, respect for the invisible labor that keeps a country's heart beating. we are near the crest now. Tenure this long starts to bend under its own weight. New Australia presses at the windows. The old man with the lawyer's pen has one more set of choices to make, and they are the hardest: how to finish strong, how to hand over cleanly, how to say goodbye without turning farewell into a farewell tour. He will not get all of it right. Nobody does. But the measure of the life won't be taken at a single dinner or in a single stumble. It will be taken in the ordinary rooms where trust was earned and kept. The trick with a long reign isn't winning the day, it's beating the calendar. You can outfox an opponent, you can't outpace time. Watch now as a seasoned Prime Minister reads the clock better than anyone around him, and the country mutating under his polished shoes. The music changing mid-song, the spotlight turning harsher. If he misjudges the beat by even half a bar, the legacy cracks. If he nails it, he leaves like a test captain who walks at 99 not out, no tantrum, no drama, just the echo of a crowd that knows it's seen the long game played clean. And inside that calculation sit the same forces that made him: women who steadied, pressed, balked, admired, and demanded. The end of the Menzies era will be decided in rooms with flowers in jam jars and in palaces with carpets thick enough to swallow footsteps. Both rooms matter. Both rooms can break a man who mistakes theatre for truth. The camera opens on Parliament in the early 1960s, air crisp, corridors humming. He has the posture of someone who's learned to carry pressure as a habit, not a crisis. The hair is wider now, the voice deeper than the microphones deserve, the jokes quicker but softer in the landing, as if he's learned. That wit is a scalpel best used sparingly. Outside, Australia is bulking up: new suburbs, new universities, new anxieties in the letterbox. Households pin their hopes to hire purchase and weekend bubbies. The country is stretching like a teenager and stumbling over its own feet. The old world of deference is fading, the new world speaks faster and interrupts. And still, on Thursday nights, branch meetings fill with women who don't much care for manifestos but know the price of milk to the halfpenny. Their verdict remains the ballast: if he sounds like a bloke who's been in government so long he's forgotten the school fate, he's done. If he still speaks like a neighbor with the keys, he lives to fight another quarter. His style remains unabashedly courtly in an age getting loud and casual. The cut of his suit, the precision of the pocket square, the unhurried manner at a lectern, it all reads to some as old hat and to others as relief. He doesn't chase slang, won't pretend to be groovy, and that restraint has a curious effect: it polarizes the chattering classes and calms the practical ones. He's the same man who once praised the forgotten people, and the people he meant haven't forgotten that. The wives of small shopkeepers and the matrons of hospital auxiliaries nod when he speaks about stability as a moral good. Their daughters at uni, though, admire the architecture and bridle at the tone. The country has one foot in the parlor and the other in the garage. He insists on talking to both without changing his voice. In cabinet, he runs a tight ship: argument welcome, disloyalty not. He tolerates cleverness only until it threatens cohesion. He has learned that unity can feel dull on the front page and priceless at 3 a.m. when decisions turn knotty. He knows when to step back and let a minister carry a brief, and when to stop an eager colleague from chasing headlines. The hardest management is cultural, keeping a long-serving outfit from acquiring the smell of a club. Here, again, women shift the oxygen. The party's women's sections, unmoved by Canberra peacocking, keep telling him exactly what doesn't work in a grocery queue. They are merciless in the ordinary way: a love, the new savings speech was vague, or those train times you waved about are wrong for Wednesdays. The memo goes up the chain with a speed no think tank can match. Paddy hears it first. She translates it into action items. The machine adjusts. His alliances abroad tighten as the security climate turns jagged. He speaks in tones measured enough to calm an anxious parent and grave enough to satisfy the hawkish. It's the domestic bridge that proves trickier: how to ask families, particularly mothers already rationing sleep because of toddlers, or shift work, to send sons into risk's way. He refuses to dress hard choices in fanfare. That refusal wins him points with those who think politics should keep its volume down when stakes are high. It costs him among those who crave zeal. In campus quadrangles, the placards turn witty and fierce. In cul-de-sacs with hills hoists, the conversation turns heavy over sausages. The argument is everywhere, in kitchens, in pubs, in letters to editors, women's hands in all of it, leaving smudges of ink and conviction. We move to a day that distills the era. Morning, he's in his office, pen nib gleaming like a surgeon's instrument, annotating a paper on university grants. He circles a line, writes, "Evidence?" in the margin, and you can almost hear the sigh of a policy officer who will soon learn to love footnotes. He flips to a brief on housing, then to one about nurses training, how to modernize without breaking what works. He doesn't treat women's issues as a velvet corner of the agenda, he treats them as the agenda because they are where the budget breathes. Midday, an event at a new campus. He speaks about scholarship as nation building, and the students clap politely, some whistle ironically, the mothers in the back with handbags on their laps clap with a satisfaction that says, "My girl won't be boxed in like I was." Afternoon, our charity hospital visit with Patty. She moves through the ward with that brisk kindness of someone who knows names, not just illnesses. He stands a pace behind, nodding to nurses, asking a small question of a young mother that makes her smile because she's been seen. Evening, our reception with diplomats. He gives a speech that glides like a waltz, lands like a handshake. Home late. He reads until his eyes swim. The pen rests. The lamp clicks off. Now to the magnet in the room, his courtliness toward the crown, distilled into that line quoted till it squeaks, "I did but see her passing by." In a younger, more ironic country, it reads to some like parody. But if you seed it in its time and purpose, it's closer to liturgy than flirtation, a ritual salute by a Commonwealth statesman to a symbol his voters still held dear. The line stirred hearts precisely because it wasn't modern, it was ceremonial music in a key the nation still recognized. Paddy, who could have been unsettled if there'd been anything to be unsettled about, treats it as theater with a wink. She's too busy organizing the next day's calls to indulge columnists wondering if admiration equals confession. It doesn't. The marriage remains, as ever, an economy of routines that shuts the door gently on nonsense. You want intrigue? Try the kind that isn't made for tabloids. There's Enid Lyons, formidable, witty, the first woman in the House of Representatives and a minister in his government, proof that he could turn admiration for talent into opportunity. Their professional respect is real, their exchanges crackle, and the significance is larger than symbolism, it tells a generation of women that the door isn't merely unlocked, it's being held open. There are senators like Ivy Wedgwood and Annabel Rankin, organizers and persuaders who shape votes in rooms the cameras rarely find. The relationships here aren't salacious, they're strategic and sincere. He is not a 1970s-style reformer, he's a mid-century conservative who knows that winning requires listening, and listening requires granting authority to the voices you rely on. The women in the party, tireless and precise, are not his decoration. They are his engine. But time is a patient opponent. Health hiccups appear like faint pencil marks that darken over months, fatigue that won't shake, a stumble in a sentence that would once have been impossible. He recovers, resets, refuses to dramatize. The staff's tone shifts from brisk to protective in tiny ways. Paddy starts catching the glass of water before he realizes he wants it. The public notices only what it must. What doesn't change is the habit of work. He keeps the discipline that has always insulated him from scandal, irregular hours, predictable routes, the quiet life of someone who thinks glamour is for opening nights and governance is a morning thing. The country meanwhile grows louder. New music slipstreams into lounges, in new manners prod at old certainties. Young women push into professions at a clip that breaks bottlenecks. Some love him as the man who funded their degrees or steadied their parents' fortunes, and others find his tone patrician, his patience too trim for the restless decade. He won't bend into a shape he doesn't recognize to please a fashion. He also won't scold. He just keeps talking to Australia like an adult. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's the exact wrong note. Leadership of this vintage is a wager that the respect you pay your audience will be returned. For a long time, it is. The 1961 scare strips the varnish and shows the grain. The margin is so fine you can count it on the fingers of an RSL Hall. Households register their complaint with the speed of a raised eyebrow. He survives, chastened, and more attentive. The lesson is painfully normal. A prosperity that doesn't feel like dinner on the table isn't prosperity. He rebalances. The country unclenches. He files the scare not under near miss but ongoing risk. There's a scene near the end that deserves a frame of its own. A quiet evening in the lodge. Papers stacked, the carved desk corner polished by decades of sleeves. Paddy comes in with 2 cups. No speech tonight, no cameras. Just the head and the heart that have run a country together for what feels like forever. How much longer? She asks, not an accusation, not a plea, just the question that has been walking around the room for months. He doesn't answer at once. He's never been a man to decide with a flourish. He counts costs, thinks in consequences, measures the dignity of departure against the duty to continue. The room is silent but for the clink of porcelain. Finally, as soon. It's the most adult word in politics, a promise to leave before the country tells you to. When he does choose the date, he does it the way he's governed, without melodrama. No grandstanding. No I alone farewell. He makes way for the next figure in the long procession, aware that even a legacy as large as his must leave room for new hands. The resignation lands like a change of season, expected, still a shock. The staff are misty-eyed. The backbench is partly relieved, partly bereft. The women who've stuffed envelopes by the thousands feel a pang they can't quite name, grief for the end of a cadence that kept the tempo of their civic lives. He steadies the moment with a simple truth, and nobody owns the lodge, you mind it for a while. Now the shape of the story changes. He returns to civilian life and, after the obligatory blur of dinners and tributes, gravitates to work that suits the first love he never lost, learning. He accepts a ceremonial role in higher education and treats it like a duty post, not a victory lap. University corridors suit him, books that don't heckle, students whose questions cut through flattery, faculty who appreciate a speech that lays out an argument like a well-made case. He moves slowly, with a dignity that isn't stiff but earned. The country has changed gear, but his presence still triggers that hush people keep for figures who anchored their childhoods. In these later years, his partnerships with women continue to define his days more than the headlines would guess. Paddy becomes, if possible, even more central, guardian of the calendar, shield against overwork, first reader of every new note he tries to refine into a public reflection. She is honored for her service in ways that might have embarrassed a lesser spirit, if she takes the sashes and letters not as decoration, but as symbols of the volunteer armies she has led. When a hospital auxiliary sends a card big enough to be a tea tray, she laughs, writes back properly, and files the names in the tidy mental drawers she's kept since the 1920s. Their daughter, observant, shrewd, tender without schmaltz, spends time with him that becomes history's luck and memories captured with the cool affection of someone who knows the difference between father and figure. Friends drop by who don't need to be impressed, and they talk cricket, books, the small news of a nation that feels smaller when you no longer steer it. He ages the way a craftsman's favorite tool does, smooth at the handle, nicked at the edges, still perfectly balanced in the hand. The public glimpses him at ceremonies, the applause less thunder than warm rain. Now and then, an interviewer tries to bait him into easy controversy. He declines, not haughtily, just with the economy of a man who has nothing left to prove and everything left to preserve. He keeps the habit that protected him all along, he tells less than he knows, he hints more than he says. Gossip merchants who waited decades for the tell-all go hungry. There is no confessional box here, because there is nothing to confess. Admiration, yes, freely given and sometimes theatrically expressed. Friendships, yes, with formidable women who could run a meeting faster than most men could find their glasses. Mistresses, no. Intrigue, only the kind that makes democracies work, alliances, debates, the elegant cruelty of a clever retort. Let's turn, just for a moment, to the image of him that has stuck in thousands of Australian kitchens, the dignified chap with a handsome voice who made steadiness feel like a patriotic act. For many women, that image is stitched to life's fabric, the year a mortgage finally shrank, the day a daughter opened a scholarship letter, the Sunday he came to town and shook hands without rushing. For other women, especially those who came into their power as the 60s swung, he is a relic to be thanked and then shelved. Both verdicts can be true at once, and he, who was better than most at holding tensions without forcing a false choice, would probably accept that duality with a wry smile. Illness shadows the last stretch with the quiet cruelty it always brings, no big speeches left, just the gentle slide into a life measured in visitors, letters, and the weather over the garden. Paddy becomes the day's architecture. She is brisk about what can be fixed and uncomplaining about what can't. The staff, fewer now, move with the reverence of people tidying a beloved library. He keeps reading until words won't behave, listening to the wireless until the music outpaces memory. The house gathers more silence than noise. It is the kind of soft ending reserved for those who made their storms elsewhere. And then, the day that closes the ledger. It comes without theatre, as most real endings do. Tributes roll in, curved with affection, peppered with the usual quibbles. Australia speaks of him the way you talk about an older cousin who taught you a trick with a coin and also bored you occasionally. At Christmas lunch, fondly, with relief that he belonged to you, with relief also that you belonged to yourself. Women who shook his hand at fetes tell their grandchildren that he smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and patience. A now grey generation of branch members toast the bloke who never flinched from a draughty haul and a plate of pikelets. The Queen sends the formal words that read like marble, friends send notes that read like warm timber. Paddy answers as long as she can. She knows better than anyone how the public loves to overcook grief. She keeps it honest. This is where the story tightens into its last paradox. You came for wives, lovers, intrigues. You stayed for a marriage that refused spectacle, for friendships with formidable women that built a modern party's spine, for flirtations with ceremony that looked like romance and were, in truth, ritual, for discipline so unfashionable that gossip gave up. The shock isn't sin, it's its absence. The drama isn't scandal, it's restraint, cultivated, defended, insisted on, over a half-century when many powerful men mistook applause for absolution. Robert Menzies' private life was not saintly in the sugar sense, it was adult in the useful sense. And the women around him, wife, daughter, colleagues, volunteers, nurses, teachers, were not his chorus. They were co-authors of the long chapter that bears his name. Legacy? It lives less in statues than in how Australians still talk about steadiness as a civic virtue, less in libraries than in the flicker of recognition when someone stands at a MIC and treats the audience like grown-ups. It lives in the reflex that says universities are national infrastructure, not a luxury, in the habit of seeing the household budget as the country's pulse, in the stubborn belief that decent manners in public life aren't a joke but a baseline. It also lives in the cautionary note, a long tenures breed complacency like damp breeds mold, and leaders, yes, even the excellent ones, must learn to leave before the music carries them off stage. He did. That, in the end, might be the neatest bow on a life tied mostly with plain string. And what of Paddy after? She carries on as she always has, by doing rather than announcing. If you want to understand the private heart of this public saga, picture her after the crowds have gone, writing thank you notes with a fountain pen that never blots, phoning the hospital matron before breakfast, filing the day's list, and, only then, allowing herself to sit by a window with a book. The nation called her Dame with the affection Australians reserve for women who get things done without making a racket. She earned it the long way. Imagine the country as a giant kitchen table, nicked and varnished by a century of elbows. On it sit three things: a battered fountain pen, a photo of a woman with a steady smile, and a folder stamped for the record. Now picture a hand, older, firm, sliding the pen toward the folder and stopping halfway, as if remembering that not everything worth knowing belongs on paper. That hesitation is the key to our last turn, the afterglow and the arguments, the myth-making and the demystifying, the way a man's life keeps working on a nation long after the speeches have faded. If you think the credits roll when a leader leaves office, you're missing the best coda. The real intrigue begins when the public starts telling itself the story a second time. The camera opens on that table, morning light coming in across the wood like a quiet tide. You can hear a distant kookaburra and the slow shuffle of an old dog finding a sunny patch. He is no longer the bloke stepping from a comcar into a scrum of microphones, he is the man neighbors nod to in the post office queue. There's relief in the smaller life, but not idleness. Letters arrive from students whose scholarships changed everything, from nurses who got new kit because a charity meeting led to a minister's call, from volunteers who reckon a decade of policy trickles down to whether the clinic has fresh paint and enough hands. He reads them with care and with a curiosity that hasn't dulled. He takes out that pen, the same one that underlined briefs in his 20s and budget papers in his 60s, and writes replies that are short, exact, and warmer than the headlines ever gave him credit for. It's not nostalgia. It's maintenance, a keeping faith with the people who paid attention. Out in the country, the memory of his time in office doesn't sit still. Women who once ironed school uniforms while the wireless carried his voice now have daughters in blazers striding into offices there. Mothers cleaned after hours. Some of those daughters regard him like a granite statue, impressive, cold to the touch. Others think of him as the builder of ramps and stairs they've just walked up. Both are right in their way, and the conversation between them becomes the nation's conversation about him. The argument is healthy, it stops a long tenure from calcifying into either worship or dismissal. It puts movement back into the portrait. And because we promised intrigue, let's track the kind that matters, the struggle over memory. It happens in living rooms and lecture theaters, in RSL halls and uni seminars, at Anzac Day dawn services and in campus debates where the microphones are turned up too loud. The question with Menzies isn't just what did he do, but what did he normalize? Stability as a civic virtue, courtesy as a governing style, universities as a public investment, home ownership as a national ethos. The women's branch meeting as a power station disguised as a morning tea. Listen closely to the modern political pitch, left, right, and somewhere in between, and you'll hear ghost notes of that language. Even those who bristle at his conservative instincts borrow the dignity of his tone when they need to sound grown up. Even those who adore him recognize the risk in staying too long at the MIC. He's become the yardstick and the warning sign in one. We pan to the cultural landscape, mid to late century, and new TV voices, new books, a country that is beginning to describe itself with a different palette. The old patrician cadence is increasingly rare, replaced by a looser rhythm, an informality that Aussies would later call no worries. Politics, sometimes said with a grin and sometimes with a grimace. But certain rituals survive, the stump speech that respects the listener, the press conference that isn't a brawl, the refusal to insult in order to persuade. Those habits didn't appear from nowhere, they were trained into the civic muscle across long years when the man with the neat pocket square set a bar for how to disagree without letting the room rot. The women who ran the party rooms, the auxiliaries, the parent committees, they kept that standard alive when the blokes got shouty. ask any veteran organizer, the first measure of a leader is whether the school fete volunteers would back him a second time. He understood that implicitly and, later, so did those who inherited the rooms he once filled. Push back in. There's a small domestic scene that tells more than any grand speech. He and Paddy at a modest luncheon, the sort of thing where the dessert is a pavlova that someone's aunt carried in with the heroics of a surf lifesaver. A young mother, nervous but determined, asks him, in that edge-of-the-voice way people use with figures from their parents' radios, why he made such a fuss about universities when neither of her parents finished school. He takes a breath, not to gather a flourish, but to pay the question its due. Because, he says, the child who can go should never be stopped by a locked door someone forgot to oil. It's a line that could be schmaltz in another mouth, and here, it lands like a policy note tucked inside a lullaby. Paddy watches, proud in that unsentimental way that makes pride look like a tidy napkin folded just so. If love can be read in behavioral cues, you can read it here, at the way she turns slightly, creating a pocket of calm around the exchange. The way he keeps his answer brief so the pav doesn't collapse while everyone's listening. What of the rumors that trailed him like old newspapers caught in a fence? They wither for lack of oxygen. Gossip's half-life is shorter than a good policy's, and the long version of the Menzies story survives precisely because it doesn't need embellishment. The courtly line about a passing queen stays where it belongs, in the Museum of Great Australian Soundbites, half joked about, half loved. The imagined catalogues of lovers remain, well, imagined. The real relationships, the ones that run on respect and output, aren't a scandal sheet, they're a spreadsheet, and names of women who chaired branches, led charities, stood for seats, ran staffs, drove agendas. A romantic might find that list unglamorous, an adult knows it's the list that keeps ambulances fueled and committee rooms full. When the nation retells this saga, that's the bit that grows larger, at the quiet coalition of competence. It's more shocking, in the end, than any tryst would have been. Now we lift the lens to compare. Australia has had its orators and its managers, its dazzlers, and its mechanics. Menzies was an orator who learned to love the mechanics. It's why he lasted. If he'd been merely silver-tongued, the country would have patted him on the head and sent him packing after a nice run. If he'd been merely diligent, it would have respected him and then forgotten him. The alchemy that held, especially for the women who were allergic to show ponies and fuss, was the marriage of flourish and follow-through. He could light a room, and he could also get the forms filled out. He never mistook applause for a completed task. In countless kitchens, that's the difference between a favorite and a fool. In the broader Commonwealth, his figure becomes a sort of ghost at the banquet, invoked when people argue for calm over heat, for institutions over improvisation. When the winds change and the glamour boys arrive with their unbuttoned collars and hungry cameras, a few low, steady voices still say, "Remember the long game." Those voices are often hers, Paddy's alumni, if you like, are the women who came up through the quiet disciplines of service and refuse to confuse noise with news. They don't dismiss modernity, they house-train it. If you're looking for Menzies heirs, don't just scan the portraits in Parliament, and check the rosters of hospital boards, university councils, community trusts. The line from his ledger to their minutes is not straight, but it is traceable. There's a public lecture late in the piece, one of those addresses that universities like to stage when they want to remind themselves that the arc of national life passes through their quadrangles. He speaks without notes. The voice has aged into something like oak, a less glossy, more resonant. He thanks the people who taught him, bows to the ones who fought him, and then slides into a meditation that works as both apology and boast. Our nation grows up when it stops asking to be entertained and starts insisting on being respected. The room hushes. The students, eyes bright, hair long, possibilities crowding their mouths, hear a challenge that's not quite their tempo and yet hits the center of the drum. In the candé, a young woman asks whether he underestimated them, women of her cohort, by speaking in a register that felt like their mother's a world. He considers. sometimes, he says, and the candor lands like breeze through a hot room. But I never mistook courtesy for condescension, and I hope you don't either. The exchange becomes a minor legend in that faculty, the old conservative who had the nerve to be exact with himself. Swing back to the home front. Paddy's calendar in these years is a minor marvel, columns of engagements written in the neat hand of a woman who treats time as a resource to be spent, not hoarded. She mentors without announcing it, places people where they'll actually help, keeps track of promises made in foyers when the microphones are already being packed into their cases. If you want to understand the engine room of Australian civic life across the decades, understand women like her, deft with names, ruthless about follow-through, intolerant of flakiness dressed up as glamour. The honours pinned to her aren't costume, they are receipts. And though the country loves to joke about titles, the wise know that some are simply handles for lifting heavy things. There's a final domestic image to hold before the lights come down, evening, late, the house settling. He in an armchair with a book open and unread, the day having outpaced the eyes, she at a desk, writing one of those thank you notes that carry more weight than any press release. On the mantel, an old photo from Jeppert, dust, crops, a boy who looks like he's already listening to a voice only he can hear. The two images, boy and old man, share the same gravity. Ambition didn't sand it off, history didn't warp it. The country loved him because he wanted to be useful more than he wanted to be adored. The country rolled its eyes at him sometimes because he wore usefulness like a tux at a picnic. Both can be true. Both are true of anyone who stuck around long enough to matter. Now, the farewell that isn't quite a farewell. The funeral, when it comes, feels less like a state drama and more like a long letter being folded and put away. Tributes do what tributes always do, they sand the splinters and miss the knots that made the timber interesting. But in lounges and kitchens, the memories stay delightfully sanded. He shook my hand twice and looked me in the eye both times. She remembered my sister's name and asked about the baby. He told a joke without being a smart ass. She got the ward its heater before winter bit. The ledger fills with these small entries until it looks like what it always was, our budget for a nation, balanced in teaspoons as well as in tons. And then, because every good yarn needs its turn, we take up the question of legacy with fresh gloves. What does it mean, in a century that moves like a startled flock of birds, to hold up steadiness as a virtue? It doesn't mean standing still. It means choosing your pace on purpose. It means knowing when a bow to ceremony keeps the roof on, and when the same bow keeps the windows shut. It means taking the women in the room, wives, colleagues, volunteers, voters, as partners in design, not as applause. It means building institutions resilient enough to survive the fashion cycle and tender enough to be used by people who don't have power to spare. It means, oddly, leaving space in your story for people who won't like you and should be able to say so without being told they hate their country. That is grown-up politics, and it doesn't go out of style even when the ties do. The final hook, offered without drums, is secrets are overrated, and standards are underrated. The best plot twist in the Menzies saga is that the intrigues you were promised turn out to be the plain, durable intrigues of adulthood. Keeping your word when the room empties, respecting ceremony without becoming its captive, loving your spouse in a way that puts duty on a timetable rather than a pedestal, admiring power without chasing it into private corners, mastering the art of goodbye while there's still applause left in the room. These things do not make headlines. They make countries. So we close where we began, at the table. The fountain pen rests, and the photo of Paddy catches the last light, and the folder marked for the record has been filled as far as it ever will be. Outside, somewhere, a tram squeals, a magpie carols, a branch meeting wraps up with leftover sandwiches wrapped in napkins and serious women already planning the next fundraiser. In some small-town library, a girl lifts her head from a schoolbook and decides that, yes, she will apply for that scholarship. In a hospital corridor, a nurse checks a roster and smiles because an extra pair of hands just came through. In a university lecture, a young man stands to speak in sentences that are careful and kind because he learned, without being told, that attention is a gift, not a prey. These are the echoes. These are the real monuments. They don't weather. They don't topple in storms. They recur. If you came to this story craving a scandal, you might feel cheated. If you came hungry for a map of how public lives are braided with private decency, you'll leave fuller than you expected. Robert Menzies, the longest-serving Prime Minister, was built in part by women who had no patience for flimflam and every patience for effort. Their fingerprints are everywhere in his record. His wife, Paddy, was his weather, fair when she could be, bracing when she had to be, constant in all seasons. His own temperament kept the worst temptations at bay. And the nation he served absorbed from him a taste for standards that still crop up like sturdy grass after a downpour. You can argue the policies, and you should. You can measure the costs, and you must. But the cadence he taught the country, the one that runs under the noise like a bass line, is simple enough to write on one line and hard enough to play for more than an hour. Treat people like adults, and try not to waste their time. And that, in the end, is the only kind of intrigue worth keeping, how a life composes itself into a melody you can hum while you're putting the bins out or sitting in a waiting room, a melody that makes you lift your chin, slow your breathing, and answer the hard question with a straight back. Not thrilling, perhaps, to the gossip pages, but enthralling, if you're in the business of building a country that can stand up in a stiff breeze. Which, last time I checked, we still are.